Hello, friends. Hello back. So, a couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to talk with Fatima Sanchez Nieto. And who's this person, you may ask?
My name, as you mentioned, is Fatima Sanchez Nieto. I use she, her pronouns. I originally grew up in Mexico. We don't have to get too much into like the super personal details. I did my PhD in the biomedical sciences, studying hematopoietic stem cell research. And then I also worked with human stem cells when I was working in the lab at the National Institutes of Health. I did my PhD across 2 continents, so part-time in Oxford, part-time at the NIH.
Well, I was interested in talking to her because I discovered this organization called Future of Research. This is an advocacy group for academic and scientific reform in the US, and one of the few back in the 2010s that really had no issues getting in the mud when it came to addressing matters of unfairness in academic labor, and also to understand with some more depth the history of academic reform more broadly. As for Future of Research, Fatima is probably their most visible member, and at some point she also stepped as an executive director. And so I got in touch with her, I just sent her an email, and she gladly accepted to have an interview. Now, let me tell you the things that I learned from that conversation. As Fatima mentioned, she did her PhD between Oxford and the NIH in the United States, so pretty smart girl. But through the process of doing her PhD, she observed the struggles and pains of her colleagues and friends.
I experienced a lot of graduate students and postdocs at the time who were going through the system and were facing bullying, harassment, poor mental health, and I saw that impacting their work.
She observed how other people experienced abuse, scarcity, mental health struggles, and she herself observed some of the shortcomings of her advisor and of the system as a whole. As she has mentioned elsewhere, researchers, if they want to make a career in academia, they also have to become leaders, advisors, trainers, teachers, but they are never really taught how to do so. And this is only one of the problems that PhDs and ECRs in general face. And so, a deep sense of care for others is what drove Fatima into learning more about this topic, about the systemic multiple issues that ECR's early career researchers face. And she also got pretty active discussing the issue on social media. That back then when Twitter was the main place for online discourse. And she also put a lot of effort into her personal blog around that time. And that, being active online, got her in touch and got her to start developing a relationship with the people in Future of Research. So progressively, she got more and more involved, and their relationship became deeper. So maybe that's also a good lesson on how important it is to participate in online spaces. After completing her PhD, she ended up shifting disciplines. She went from the biomedical sciences into the social sciences, going fully professional, full research mode into studying and understanding the issues of ECRs. And Future of Research grew around the same time. And from what Fatima tells me, Future of Research, this organization started with a small group of postdocs who also deeply cared about these problems.
Future of Research as an organization started as a group of postdocs in the Boston area, and this was, mind you, so 10 years ago, we did not have as many postdoc unions or grad student unions as we do now, at least in the United States. And we can talk about the labor movement or the unionization of graduate school and postdocs. But it was a group of postdocs getting together, recognizing that they had a lot of issues, recognizing that when they brought those issues up on their own in their departments or even at the level of their institutions, a lot of times they were dismissed by faculty and administrators who didn't care, who didn't see things the same way, or who saw the issues but thought that the grad students and the postdocs didn't understand the system well enough to be making suggestions on how to fix it.
And so, because they cared, they got together, they organized conferences, they collected data, they got to understand that there was a problem, that the problem was real, and that it was a big one. And then at some point in the process, they finally incorporate as an NPO. So the story is really a typical one to a degree. You have a group of people who deeply cared about something, who observed that there was a problem that was not being addressed, and so decided to get together and try to fix it. But this happy story of a successful project is one where the researcher skills shine, at least in my perception. And that's because at Future of Research, they do research to try to understand the problem. They organize conferences, academic conferences, to try to intellectually, in an informed way, discuss the problem and try to come up with solutions to it. And they also do another pretty important thing that researchers do, at least in theory. They try to teach about it. They offer training.
We published on postdoc salaries at a time when people didn't know what postdocs were getting paid in the United States. We provided guidance for postdocs when the Obama administration was passing FMLA, restrictions around essentially overtime and whether or not that would affect postdocs and which postdocs it would affect. We ran a lot of conferences on mentor-mentee relationships. We looked at ghostwriting for peer review. So this was where the professor got asked to do a review, didn't have time to do the review, gave it to their postdoc, took it back, and then claimed the review had been from them, right, and called it training. And there were a lot of people that were telling us, like at the grad and postdoc level, that this was happening. Again, we would talk about it. People would say, oh, that doesn't happen. So we collected data around that. And we published it as a phenomenon that actually does happen, and then provided suggestions for ways forward. And then we also looked at how many early career researchers, or ECRs, as you mentioned earlier, were on the board of directors for larger professional societies or scientific organizations. So we did quite a bit of work, hosted conferences, we're tweeting for quite a while, had information up on our website.
But actually, one of the most important things that helped move the organization forward is the fact that they got some pretty good, nice, generous funding. They got a big bag of money, and of course that allowed to keep the lights on, and that allowed to pay for the work that's necessary to maintain an organization like this. Now, one quite important achievement, a future of research that Fatima and I discussed, is that the organization, or more precisely one of its founders, Gary McDowell, realized that there was no national level data showing how much postdocs in the United States were being paid. And that is pretty bad if you're a postdoc and you want to know how fair your work environment is. So similarly, McDowell got on the phone, called every single public university in the US, and asked for that data, which by law they have to give, if they're public. And he similarly documented the process in a blog, which I think is pretty awesome. And as Fatima tells me, this was a great achievement, because these very basic data, this very broad data, which was not available before, well, obviously it was available now, and it allowed any postdoc in the US to know that the experiences that they were having, that the problems that they were facing were not only of their own, but that there was a systemic problem all across the country, that the whole wider system was unfair. And that is empowering, to know for sure that your problems are not just your own, that you are not the problem. But notwithstanding their great freaking achievements, Future of Research came to an end. Because notwithstanding the quality of their work and how much they were contributing societally, money was still a problem.
So our grant didn't get renewed. We spent quite a bit of time trying to find funding, and as a nonprofit, mostly run by volunteers who were at the time either doing their graduate studies or their postdoc, or were going up for junior faculty, positions. It takes a lot of time. Gary was the only person on staff who was actually doing these things. We had a part-time person helping with grants during a small time.
That big juicy grant that they received, that came to an end, and it was not renewed. Similarly, the funding agency decided that this incredibly fucking important goal, the goal of giving good basic living conditions to some of the most professional, well-trained people in the country, the people who are developing national science, that this was not important enough. So, Future of Research had to shift to a mostly volunteer-based organization. And also, COVID just happened around the same time. So, things got pretty difficult for our heroes. But, around the same time, other similar efforts were starting to appear in the US. Unions started to become more common, and so, even though Future of Research started to fade out, as Fatima tells me, they did not lament it.
But I think it was operations, right? We didn't have... It became this thing where we were spending most of our time writing for continuing operations. But this was at the time when postdoc unions were becoming more common, grad student unions were becoming more common. And so it seemed like a lot of the work that we were doing was getting redistributed to the local level, and people were organizing at the local level, which was something that was really important. But I personally thought and saw that as a good thing. And also, it's really hard to run a nonprofit as a volunteer on the side when you've got a full-time grad or postdoc or staff scientist position.
A new generation of efforts was being born. The torch was being passed. And so Future of Research came to an end, but nonetheless, their members went on to continue doing great work and great research. Now let me go into the second part of this video. Now I want to share with you some of my reflections, some of the thoughts that I have in my head after having this conversation with Fatima. One of the things that I have been most interested in is the amount and the degree over time of organizations that have been trying to reform academia. This is, of course, a very key basic aspect to understand the history of scientific reform. So I was pretty interested when Fatima told me that by the end of Future of Research, around 2019 and 2020, a great number of postdoc and graduate degree unions started to appear. So I wanted to check that. I wanted to find data, and also I wanted to try to figure out why. Why at this point? And why not before, if the conditions were already pretty bad before? And I also wanted to confirm how pioneering and influential Future of Research actually was. And it seems like when it comes to unions, to their total number, and to the number of members affiliated with them, what Fatima told me is true. They indeed grew tremendously after 2019 and 2020. But as for my reason of why that happened, I guess the obvious answer is that, well, COVID happened. But way before the pandemic, from what I found, it seems like the topic of ECR unionization was already controversial since the early 2010s, if not since the late 2000s. And I say this based on this article in Nature that I found from 2010. And the article sounds pretty alarmed about the possibility of unionization becoming a widespread idea in the US. And this happened in the context of the University of California Postdoc Union assuring a very good deal with their institution. But sadly, I didn't find more data about unionization, ECR unionization, before 2013. And I would really like to know what were the numbers before 2013, because at least after 2013, up to a couple years after that, the numbers look pretty stable. So I really wonder, for example, if after this event with the postdoc union at the University of California, there was an actual increase in their numbers in the whole USA. But we can see what happened after 2013. And we can see that around 2016, when Future of Research became an official NPO, there was this little bump, this little increase in unions in the USA. Then things remain more or less stable, and then we have the explosion in their numbers after the pandemic. So we know that these fluctuations happened. We know pretty obviously that most likely the pandemic played a role in this big increase after 2019 and 2020, but I still don't know what were other reasons behind these progressive increases. But at least we know that over time, the number in unions have continually grown, and most likely Future of Research and their excellent work probably played a role in facilitating that and on keeping the momentum going, at least. But there's more research to do on that side.
Well, I mean, I think it happened because people were fed up, honestly. I mean, people were recognizing that their labor was being exploited. Again, when you have some of the, most highly trained, and not to get too elitist, but when you have people who have spent a significant amount of time training to get, their careers in order, who then can't afford to pay rent, or are living below the poverty line, or can't afford to buy groceries, or can't afford to start a family or pay off their student debt, etc., who are getting paid on 50% effort because the other 50% is supposed to be education, but are working in the lab, 60 plus hours. There's a collective recognition that labor is being exploited, that labor is being extracted from a group of people to benefit an institution. I think movements like Future of Research were sort of like a pre-unionization effort. There was always, I think, pressure boiling underneath the surface, and we had little pieces of it like breaking through and breaking up.
Now, my second reflection. And here I want to explain something that I see as a very paradoxical situation. Remember this little thing that I mentioned, that one of the most important, or at least most notorious achievements of Future of Research, at least in the opinion of Fatima, was this data they collected and they analyzed about how much postdocs were being paid all around the USA. Indeed, these data most probably help a lot of postdocs and up-and-coming postdocs in the US realize that they had legitimate reasons to unionize. This is research that was socially influential, or at least socially valuable. And remember this other thing that I mentioned, that the work at Future of Research really showed the skills of their members as researchers, because of course, a part of doing research, they were organizing academic conferences, they were teaching about it, they were offering training, they were doing work that clearly had a societal impact and societal value. They were doing all the things that fit with what we expect from researchers and scientists to do, with what we would like most scientists to achieve, right? Nonetheless, even when they were doing that, they still struggle to continue doing their work. They still struggle with money, with funding. Now, is this the paradox? Is it the paradox that I see? The fact that these researchers who were doing excellent work were not receiving money even when they were doing the things that policymakers and institutions usually say that want to see coming from researchers? No, the paradox that I see is that these researchers were already affiliated to research institutions, to research centers, to universities. And isn't it the mission of research centers and of universities to provide funds, to provide support, so that researchers can do precisely this type of work? So even though they were affiliated to universities and research centers, they still had to do the work of future of research outside of their institutions, outside of their regular jobs. They had to do it on their free times, basically. So I guess the question there is, why aren't more universities supporting their employees when they try to do the work that they are supposed to be doing? And you may say that the problem is a matter of disciplines, that probably these researchers were already in laboratories or research centers or departments where the work being done was not precisely the work that it wanted to do in future research. But nonetheless, shouldn't research institutions and universities be more prepared to supporting the new ideas of researchers? Isn't that a part of the work of a scientist? To come up with new ideas, to discover things? And on the other hand, the work that they were trying to do was not irrelevant for their departments or for their disciplines. After all, they were trying to study and understand their own experiences and the experiences of their communities in their disciplines as academics, as researchers. The work that they were trying to do will be work that may have not fit with the goals of the discipline that they were being a part of, but it was still work that will have benefited the community of researchers in that field, in that discipline. But why aren't more universities, departments, etc. supporting more of this work? Supporting work that's most likely going to contribute the institution, to make its members more productive, more capable, better organized. At this point, it doesn't even sound like a paradox, it just sounds like institutional stupidity. Maybe what this means is that academic and research institutions and universities have become, subject to the typical pressures that other public institutions also face, behaving more alike corporations, seeking short-term gains, efficiency and productivity within certain limited metrics, having to cut corners, instead of dedicating themselves to the goal, to the mission of learning, of extending human knowledge, of discovery, of creating solutions for societal problems, and of taking good care of their own members. Nonetheless, another thing that worries me a lot is this mechanism that universities seem to have to gaslight their members, their students.
When they brought those issues up on their own in their departments or even at the level of their institutions, a lot of times they were dismissed by faculty and administrators who didn't care, who didn't see things the same way, or who saw the issues but thought that the grad students and the postdocs didn't understand the system well enough to be making suggestions on how to fix it.
So it seems like we have this common situation where students approach their institutions to say, hey, there is a problem. And to that, the institution replies, actually, there's no good evidence, there's no research to show that there is a problem. And as an institution, we are not funding that research. So actually, there's no data. So actually, there's no problem. So you are wrong. Fuck you.
And it is unconscionable, in my opinion, that when the people you are claiming to serve are complaining to you because they can't afford rent or they can't afford to pay their groceries, that you continue to hold, your heels back and say that what they're asking for is too much, right?
And my final reflection from my conversation with Fatima. And this is something that worries her a lot, or that's what she told me. And it is the fact that after so much work, after ringing so many times the alarm about the exploitation of ECRs, after more than 10 years seeing the struggles of her peers with abuse, with exploitation, with unfair labor conditions, after all of this, she keeps seeing the same patterns repeating. ECRs going through the same problems that other folks were going through decades ago. Has the system really changed?
And this is one of the things that Gary and I actually talk about on the regular basis, is because the PhD and the postdoc is such a transient position by nature, and such an isolating position by nature. A lot of times what you get, at least at the local level, is these efforts that start up, they're being led by one person. And then as soon as that person leaves, there's no like sustainability to the effort. And so how do you create this institutional knowledge, as we call it?
So the big question becomes, how do we stop the cycle? How do we learn collectively and generationally? How do we stop our new members, new ECRs, from going through the same problems that their predecessors had to go through? My innocent answer in that conversation was that research is precisely one of the big venues to provide, to allow that generational learning. But as Fatima correctly noted, we need more than just that. We need to ask not only how to do that research, how to get that knowledge, but also how to share it.
And if you do just a little bit of research or reading into it, people were talking about the postdoc problem in the 60s. People were predicting the mess that we were going to be in since like the 1960s and 70s. This isn't a new issue. So yes, to your point, it's not just doing research, but it's also keeping that research in writing and making sure that people understand when they come into these fields that there is a history and an evidence base that can be used without needing to start from scratch.
As academic communities, it is also a question of history, but not only a question of academic intellectual history, it is a question of live history, living history, history that's present in the fact of a community having knowledge about itself and about its past. But the tricky problem here is, how do we do this in the case of ECRs, of early career researchers, of people who by definition are in transient positions, in positions of quote-unquote training? This is a highly mobile population. They will move soon to other positions, to other institutions, even to other countries. That happens a lot. So the big question is, how do we build and maintain a history that's alive in the knowledge that a community has about itself and its past, in the case of a community that just shifts so much, in the case of a community that's global, that moves around the world? Maybe that's what we have the internet for.
But it was empowering people with data. It was empowering people with tools. It was empowering people with this idea that, yes, the shittiness that you feel, excuse my language, but like the shittiness that you feel in your working conditions, the mental health struggles, but in telling people you are not alone in your struggles. This is a normal thing that people are going through, even though it should not be normal. There is a lot of power that comes in coming together and realizing that it's not just you struggling and suffering from all of these things, but that other people are going through it too. So I think, that was one of the things that we did that started all of this, people. And I think for me, if I can support people who are struggling and who are hurting, support people who feel alone, then support people who need to recognize that they have power in their voices. If I can use my positionality to elevate other people's stories, then I think that is work worth doing.